So welcome along to this webinar to look at the age-appropriate design code, or as the ICO I noticed today started calling it, the children's code, which is a new code that comes into force today, addressing basically age-appropriate design from a data protection perspective for online services aimed at children. I'll explain a bit more about what all this actually means as we go through. So my name is Mark Gracey. I run a business called Mark Gracey GDPR. Does exactly what it says on the tin, which is I support businesses and help them with GDPR compliance. I'll talk a bit more about my services towards the end. I've worked in data protection mainly across the internet and telecoms industry since the late 90s, when the Data Protection Act 1998 came into force, and that was the beginning of a 15 or so year career in regulation, mainly around internet and telecoms regulation, but with an angle on data protection compliance, dealing with law enforcement and other data related bits of legislation that impacted on the internet industry over the sort of 90s and 2000s. So yeah, I won't dwell too much on all that. If you're interested, more than happy to have a conversation, or yeah, feel free to look at read this slide in full when you get sent it through. So what we're covering today, well, I'm going to do a quick introduction and background into the code and sort of set the scene with regards to what the code is all about. Then we'll look at the 15 standards, which are the core part of what the code is. The code expects you to follow, and then just a single slide sort of summarizing what you should be thinking about doing right now going forward until it comes into force in a year's time. And then, as I said, hopefully there's some time for Q&A at the end, but yeah, feel free to use chat to ask questions as we go through. So this is all about GDPR, of course. The Information Commissioner has produced this age-appropriate design code. Hopefully don't need to recap this in too much detail, but this is the code specifically is about children's data. There are elements of GDPR that apply specifically to the processing of children's data. So for consent, for example, a child under the age of 13 is unable to give consent, and you have to get parental consent as well. But as a general approach, the code is basically implementing GDPR elements in relation to the processing of children's data, where a child is defined as under 18 according to the code, and it shouldn't be too much of a surprise in terms of some of the things that are in there. But of course, just to recap very quickly, GDPR is about the protection of personal data. That's any data that enables you to identify an individual. For the purposes of today's discussion, we'll obviously be talking about parents and children. The data protection principles set out the rules around what you should and shouldn't be doing with data. You have to have a lawful basis for each of the purposes for which you're processing data. Consent is probably the most well-known. Legitimate interest is also quite popular, but there's other ones as well. And individuals' rights are the rights of the individual. So for the purposes of today's talk, we'll be talking about the rights of the children primarily. And then you have this new data protection principle called accountability, which sets out basically you have to prove that you're GDPR compliant. So it's not good enough that you think you might be, but you have to actually be able to demonstrate that you are. And there are certain obligations, like having documentary evidence of your processing activities or some kind of register or data audit or data inventory. Some organizations require to have a data protection officer, being able to show that you have policies and train your employees to understand the basics of data protection and so forth. Probably one of the key things that should crop up in any discussion around products and services, whether aimed at children or not, is around the concept of data protection by design and by default. So that's data protection from day one of a project, not as an afterthought, and the use of data protection impact assessments, which will crop up because it's one of the 15 standards. So so that's GDPR in a very small nutshell. where does the code come into this? Well, it's actually a statutory code according to section 123, which is in part 5 of the Data Protection Act 2018. So this was the UK legislation that came in parallel with GDPR coming into force on the 25th of May 2018. And it basically obliges the Information Commissioner to generate a code of practice for age-appropriate design of relevant, what they call information society services, which are likely to be accessed by children. So it's a legally obliged code in the sense that the Information Commissioner has had to produce it. They've had to, according to I think section 125 of the Act, have to consult relevant stakeholders, and the code has to be approved by Parliament. So it's basically been drafted, consulted upon, finalised, published by the ICO. It's probably published a few months ago, I think, placed, basically presented to the Houses of Parliament, where it went through the usual internal government discussions, and then it was recently approved and was, I think, officially published by the ICO on the 12th of August for it to come into force on the 2nd of September, which of course is today. And I noted the BBC's running a story about it, and the ICO have updated their website today with, or overnight, with a bit more information and some FAQs and further guidance. Just look for the children's code section. As I say, the official title is quite a mouthful, but essentially is the age appropriate design code, and they're now calling it the children's code as well. So if you hear that term, then it's basically the same thing. There is a forward from the Information Commissioner herself, setting out why a code's needed. So apart from the fact that the government require the ICO to do what one, they basically set out that basically data is at the, as it says there, at the heart of services offered to children every day. But what's happening with that data, who's using it, what controls do the children have over it? And as more and more children come online and start using online services, they may not necessarily, possibly because of their age, understand the risks. And I think kind of the stark paragraph is the third one there. For all the benefits the digital economy can offer children, we're not currently creating a safe space for them to learn, explore and play. So there has been for some time significant worries about children's use of technology, the internet and so forth. And this is the ICO's personal data take on addressing some of the concerns about the access to children's data and the use of online services by children, whether they're intended for children or otherwise. As it says at the bottom there, the statutory code of practice looks at changing that, not by seeking to protect children from the digital world, but protecting them when they're in it or within it. So that's just a snapshot of the, was actually, I think, the introduction to their, the Information Commissioner's forward at the beginning of the code. And you can see that on the ICO's website. So what's the actual code doing? Well, it aims to protect children's data when they're using certain online services. It applies to what's called information society services and the providers of those services. There's 15 standards of age appropriate design, which we'll talk about going forward. The code will be taken into consideration in any enforcement action, and I'll talk a bit in a second about some of the enforcement elements of it. So basically, if you're running one of these services that falls within the scope of the code and yet you're ignoring the 15 standards or any elements of the code, then it will probably be held against you if there was ever an investigation or some enforcement action taken by the ICO. As I said, it comes into force today on the 2nd of September. And there's a 12-month transition. So you've got 12 months to basically put into place your compliance with the code, either for any new services or existing services as well. So 2nd of September 2021 is the key date for implementation if you're impacted by the code. Now, in terms of what services are actually covered by this code, it's essentially any online service likely to be accessed by a child. Now, that may be a service specifically aimed at children, but it could also be services that are also most likely to be used by a child, even if the intention is not originally for it to be a children-related service. So that covers quite a wide range of online services. There are some exemptions. So if you provide preventative or counselling services, if you're a public authority, if you just have a website that is a general business about the business and products and services you sell, rather than actually selling them or providing other associated services that might be of interest to a child, then you're not covered by this code. If you offer traditional phone services, then you're not covered. But if you offer VoIP or other sort of internet related communication services that children are likely to use, then you are covered. And it also doesn't cover sort of traditional, I suppose, or as they call it, general broadcast services. So scheduled television and radio, for example, is not covered, but streaming services or what's it called, video on demand type services, then they are covered by the code. As I think I've mentioned already, for the purposes of the code, a child is defined as under 18 for the purposes of GDPR, and where children's data has to be managed from a GDPR perspective differently, which is typically whether they can or can't give you consent, then it's actually defined as the age 13. But for the purposes of the code, it's any service that is likely to use by anybody under the age of 18. It applies to all businesses operating within the UK. It also applies to businesses outside the European Economic Area who offer services in the UK or track behaviours. And post the Brexit transition period at the end of this year, then it will also include European Economic Area businesses as well. So the whole code is called an age appropriate design code. It's all about age appropriateness of settings and how the service operates with regards to the processing of personal data for children, and spread throughout the code. You'll see it if you look at some of the 15 standards, and there is actually an annex to the code which includes this definition of varying different considerations based on the age of the child. So I'm not going to get, there's quite a lot of information on this, and I just put it there for information. It's basically a summary of the appendix that the ICO provide, but they basically split the age groups of children into these 5 areas: 0 to 5, so pre-literate and early literacy; 6 to 9, core primary school age; 10 to 12, transition years; 13 to 15, early teens; and 16 to 17-year-olds who are approaching adulthood. And the key sort of takeaway, just if you look at just this element of what the code aims to achieve, is the understanding that different ages of children will be at different developmental positions in terms of their learning, their understanding. So if all your privacy information is written and you're aiming at 0 to 5-year-old children, then that's probably not going to be very helpful, because they're probably not very competent at reading necessarily yet. Where you get round to early teens and approaching adults, then they're less likely to rely on parental support and more likely to be bothered by peer pressure and so forth. So one of the key takeaways, other than the 15 standards, has got to be you need to understand your audience and the likelihood of people or children accessing your service, and then tailor your approach to the 15 standards according to what is appropriate for the age ages that you're using. And you know, if that means you're spanning your service over a varied range of child, then you need to adapt that accordingly, and that shows up in some of the things that we'll look at. So a question just come through. Let me just quick look at that, see if I can answer that now. What about if we have a general business website not aimed at children, but we run seasonal competitions on our social media channels, e.g. seasonal promotions, win an iPad? That's a good question. I have a suspicion that it probably isn't covered. Certainly your general business website will not be covered. if a child is likely to enter into it, it's not the main function of your website. So I very much suspect that you'll probably be okay for seasonal promotions. But I can't say I've seen anything specifically about that kind of thing. I mean, I'm guessing if you have terms and conditions that say children aren't allowed to, you know, somebody has to be over this certain age to be able to enter, then you would be relying on that as a reason why children shouldn't be using it. That said, you should, as always, be very mindful of the fact that you'll be collecting data and presumably offering those seasonal promotions or win an iPad or whatever it is for a particular reason. And if that reason is collecting data of potential prospects, then you'll need to consider the GDPR and the privacy rules anyway, and it wouldn't do any harm to consider the children's things. But yeah, if you want to drop me an email asking that question again, I'll see if I can find anything that gives you a bit more specific answer rather than me supposing that I don't think you're probably covered. Okay, so that's a way of looking at how to consider the age appropriateness of what you're offering. And finally, in this introductory part, before we get onto the 15 standards, enforcement, what is that going to look like? Well, as I said, it comes into force today. You've got 12 months to implement. So from the 2nd of September 2021, it will be fully enforceable. If you don't follow the code, it's going to be difficult for you to demonstrate your compliance, and it will be used as part of the ICO's approach to enforcement. And what that enforcement might look like is going to be no different than any other kind of enforcement that they do. Just because we don't tend to see many headline fines or activities doesn't mean the ICO is not inundated by complaints. I think their recent report said that there's sort of tens of thousands of complaints they've had to deal with, and tens of thousands of data breaches reported, and various issues. So I think a lot of what they'll be doing from an enforcement point of view is relying on people complaining, or that they might do some monitoring, or they might do some spot checking. They have the powers to do what they call consensual audits, which is to basically ask you that if it's all right for them to come in and audit you, and they'll set out the premise by which they'll carry out the audit. But GDPR fines would apply if they chose to enforce whatever the issue is that they've investigated, and that falls in the upper bracket of GDPR fines. So not that we'd ever probably see them this high, but the upper level, as you probably remember, is 4% of global turnover, or 20 million euros, whichever is the largest. But there's been no evidence that we would ever see anything that high. But just to give you the context of what fines could potentially look like. And I think the most significant thing there is what I put in that left-hand circle in brackets. The ICO's, the Information Commissioner's Office, sees the protection of children's data as a priority, and they've been engaging in various other initiatives in the UK around protecting children as well. So all in all, you're going to have a pretty good reason not to comply with this code if you're clearly within the bounds of it being within the definition of an online service aimed at children, or likely to be used by children. So the core part of the code of practice are basically the 15 standards of age appropriate design. And I'm going to go through each of these very quickly, because we haven't got all day to go through them. But I'm pretty much summarizing the key aspects that the ICO set out need to be considered for each of the different standards. So the first standard is about your data collection, your processing. What you're doing has to be done with the best interests of the child. And there's a lot of information about expectations around safeguarding and protecting children in general, let alone in an online environment. But it's about things like making sure that what you're designing and developing, or what you're providing that a child is using, keeps them safe from exploitation, for example, supports their health and well-being, supports their emotional and psychological development, enables them to develop appropriate views and integrity, their right to freedom and the ability to play, supporting children with disabilities, recognizing the role of parents and those with parental responsibility, and also understanding that there is a capacity for a child to develop in its or evolve, as the ICA puts it, in its understanding of different technologies. And one of the issues around, from a GDPR point of view, about understanding the appropriate age of a child being 13 or under is all about them being able to understand the consequences of what's happening to their personal data if they give it out or they hand it out without necessarily understanding what it might be used for. And if we go back to that slide that I had earlier about, you know, different age appropriate scales, then, you know, a key thing in that, as you move around clockwise around that diagram, is all about the ability of the child going from not being able to read text, so don't give text as the you know, your privacy information in lots of text because it's probably not going to be read by the child, versus where things might be when you get to teenagers and those approaching adults, and generally an ability, a cognitive ability to understand what privacy is, what it means for them as an individual, and so forth, and who they engage with and how they might interact, how they might test boundaries and so forth. So as a summary, what you're doing, and no doubt this is at the core of why you're doing it, so hopefully this is not too testing, is in the best interest of the child, and there's lots of UNESCO and child protection definitions of ways in which you can do things in the best interest of the child, and the ICO have called upon a lot of that for this element of the code. So that's the first standard. All processing and the application and use of personal data should be in the interest of the child. And then a key component of GDPR, and in my opinion, one that's very underused, is the Data Protection Impact Assessment, the DPIA, which is essentially a risk assessment. What am I doing with data? What are the risks? And how do I mitigate those risks? So it's no surprise, because of this, you know, whether it's age appropriate design code you're looking at, or the principles of data protection by privacy, data protection and privacy by design and by default, that data protection impact assessments have a role to play. And the ICO expects you to review your data protection impact assessment, assuming that you've already got one, making sure that you're clear that it describes your processing, that you've consulted with the relevant stakeholders if appropriate, that you've assessed the data that you're processing and that it's proportionate and fits with the principles of data protection, that you've identified the risks, you've worked out how you're going to mitigate those risks, and you therefore got documentary evidence that you've considered all of the privacy risks to children within your processing of their personal data, taking into consideration the age appropriateness of who your target market or users may be. So that's data protection impact assessments. Hopefully that's not too much of a surprise, on the basis that the ICO expects you to basically carry out a DPIA whenever you do something new or different with data, and if you're processing children's data, the ICO sees that as a high risk activity, so they would certainly expect you to have a data protection impact assessment anyway. The age appropriateness comes into the third standard, and that's age appropriate application, and that basically means you need to understand who the ages of your users, realize what that means. So that goes back to the different age groups and what their abilities are in understanding privacy, reading, etc., and basically adopting that into your data processing of your application or your service that fits within what's covered by the code. So it's all about basically understanding that age appropriateness and adapting your processing activities, your privacy policies, the information you provide when it comes to transparency, Because don't forget, everything that GDPR stands for applies to this. Just the fact that we're talking about children doesn't change anything. GDPR still applies, so you need to understand your principles, your lawful basis, setting out the right to be informed, being a privacy policy, etc., and all of that needs to be provided and produced in a way that is appropriate to the age groups that you're targeting or your users fit within. And you need to do that based on that those 5 age groups that I've flicked backwards and forwards to since we started. So that's standard 3, age appropriate applications. That's understanding basically your users and what age they are, and understanding the implications of their age on their understanding and how you present things to them when it comes to privacy options and so forth. Which leads us neatly on to the 4th one. Sorry, before I go on to the 4th one, I just spotted a question. Does that mean that we must collect and profile the user's ages, even if the main aim is to try and not track anyone at all? Well, it's not so much about tracking, it's more about, well, I suppose that, yes, I suppose there is an element of tracking, isn't there? Because if your product or service is going to be used long term, then the way that you present stuff may be changing through a child's age life cycle, as it were. But actually, I think the key thing is not so much the tracking, but it's actually understanding, well, the majority of people that use our platform are of a certain age, and therefore we have to implement our privacy and data protection approach according to that age. If you span a whole range of ages, so if you are talking about track in the sense of understanding that at this point we need to explain it in this way, but actually when 10 years later we need to explain it in a different way, implying that you have a vast range of ages that use your platform or your service, then you need to be able to present the information maybe in different ways to different users, and that might mean needing to understand the age of the child. But it depends on depends on how your product or service operates, I guess. So the 4th standard is about transparency. This, again, shouldn't be any surprise. So the right to be informed is the thing that gives us privacy policies. That's all about transparency and openness about processing, so that there should be no surprise to the data subject, regardless of their age, how their data is being used. Of course, one of the data protection principles is about processing data lawfully, fairly, and transparently. And that's all about being able to explain clear privacy information in a way that the child or the age of the child is likely to understand, providing, as it calls, bite-sized explanations when things change, or if somebody's going to change a setting in your product's privacy settings, then you are expected to display a additional piece of information just to explain the implications of that. You have to set out clear terms and conditions, policies and standards of what you expect you to be doing with regards to personal data, but also maybe even the use of the platform, depending on what you're offering. So the 4th standard is all about transparency and being open and clear about what you're doing and how you're going to be using personal data, and presenting that information in a way that doesn't cause confusion and works according to the age of the child. The 5th standard, detrimental use of data. That should be pretty obvious as well. You should basically make sure that you don't misuse data. So you shouldn't be doing that anyway, because that's what GDPR is all about. You must make sure you don't process children's data in a way that is detrimental to them, remembering that the 1st standard being all about processing being in the interests of the data subject or the child. That does mean you need to keep up to date with current thinking about how children interact with online services and their comprehension about privacy or expectations around privacy. And it also means you're expected to follow any industry codes, sector codes, or even ICO codes about the way that data is used for things like marketing, for example, or behavioral advertising. The couple of things that the ICO pick out. But essentially, the detrimental use of data standard is about you understanding not to misuse the data, which, as I said, you shouldn't be doing, but also understanding what is good practice with regards to the processing of children's data according to where it is now. So, this fits within the accountability principle, needs to keep an eye on changing scenarios and changing situations, and being able to adapt whatever it is you're doing accordingly. So the sixth standard is about policies and community. You clearly need to have a privacy policy, and that privacy policy has to be written in a way that the target audience is going to understand. You must make sure that you stick to what you say in your privacy policy. In fact, the ICO actually set out that whatever you say in terms of your community policies, your approach to the use of the application, should all be enforced and applied according to what you set out. Now, I can only guess that the ICO's view here is that some organisations might say they do one thing and they don't actually enforce it in others. So in other areas. So I think the ICO here are basically saying you need certain policies in place. You need to have how you expect users on the platform to interact with each other and behave, and you need to actually enforce that so that it's not detrimental to the child and the other users. So that's a relatively straightforward one. Data protection by default is basically the seventh standard. They expect you to have privacy settings set to high privacy by default, meaning that the risk to privacy is low from the outset, but is, if needed to be, can be configured by the individual user. And that still requires you to give age appropriate, as it says, prompts when they may change the settings. So you've got a high privacy setting by default, and if something changes because the user instigates the change, then you have to pop up or whatever it is that works best to explain the implications of what that change might mean. You also need to allow people, or users I should say, to switch in and out of the settings as they wish, and make sure that any settings that are set aren't reset or set to different standards when you upgrade the software or something changes with your functionality. And it also talks about basically building in multi-user choices for different users. So it's about recognizing, and I guess this goes back to the previous question about understanding the age of your users. It's about understanding that different users may have different choices, and that may be driven by parental guidance, or possibly even the age of the child. And therefore, if depending on what the service is, then there may be a need to have different settings for different users, rather than one whole privacy setting for the whole application. So a lot of this, I think, should hopefully be pretty obvious, and it's just the way that it's being pulled together by the ICO that makes it seem quite strict. But these are the kind of things that you would want to have in place anyway, because you've got your reputations to not be seen to be misguiding or misleading children, particularly when it comes to their personal data or their use of services, particularly online. So data protection by default, make sure you have privacy settings set to high. So there's the minimum amount of risk from the default, and the user has to change those if they want to, and they understand what those changes actually mean. You only collect the data you need. So this is one of the data protection principles, the principle of minimization. And that is you only collect and process data that you actually need for the delivery of the service. So you should be clear on what that is or what that needs to be. If there are optional elements, then you can give users choices so that they can choose to give you that information if they want to, remembering that they're in GDPR terms, if you are going to be doing something different with data, or you need other data and you're collecting consent, then if they're under 13, you will also need parental consent as well. And only collect the data at the point of which it's relevant to collect it. Don't collect everything up front if there's an element of your service that won't necessarily be used by every user, and therefore if there's additional stuff you need to collect on the way through the application or whatever it is you're offering, then only collect that data when you actually or when the child actually gets to use that part of the service, if that's relevant. Data sharing, again, another GDPR typical element is about, you don't share data with anybody who's not lawfully entitled to see it. And if you do need to share data, then you've got to have a very clear lawful basis for doing so. When it comes to this, these standards, the 9th standard is about data sharing. Don't share child's data unless you absolutely have to. Always bearing in mind the implications and the interests of the child. And therefore the risks to the child from that sharing. Now, depending on what you're doing and what service you're offering, you may be obliged by law or by other public tasks and stuff like that. If you're providing a service on behalf of education or the government, then there's a chance that you may have to share data, but it's about understanding that you need to have a lawful basis for that sharing, and you've got to be very clear that when it comes to child's data, you don't share that data unless you really absolutely have to, and you take into consideration the implications of the fact that it's a child's data and what that could mean for the child as the user. Number 10 in the 15. So with how are we doing for time? Not too bad. So we're 2/3 through. Is geolocation information. So any geo-related information within your service must be turned off by default. It must be clear to the child when it's turned on that it's turned on and what that actually means. And there should also be enough information for the child to understand the implications of that, whether it be visible to others, for example, if there's some parental implications around that as well. So if you're using geolocation information, you should only have those settings turned on if the user selects them, and you need to provide enough information for them to understand the implications of that and who else might have access to that geolocation information. Which kind of leads us into the 11th standard, which is around parental controls. This isn't controls that enable parents to take control of apps. It's more about, it is partly about that, but it's more from the angle of being clear to the child that there are parental controls and what that actually means. So the child understands if a parent is able to use the service, the application or whatever it might be, to work out where the child is or what the child's doing, and whether the child can expect, whether the child's parent or the person with parental responsibility can impact the use of the service, and if there is monitoring involved, which goes back to the the geolocation bit as well, the child needs to understand that that is happening and going on. And you'll see that age appropriateness is cropped up in both of those bullets on that diagram. So again, that needs to be the information, and any information you provide has to be age appropriate. So it has to be targeted to your key audience so that they understand it in the way that they would understand, depending on their age and their abilities. So there's nothing stopping you putting parental controls in place, but this element of the code, the 11th standard, is about making sure that the child understands what those options are, what control parents have over the service, and what they might be doing with any information that the parents might have access to. The 12th standard is about profiling. So again, profiling options have to be off by default. If it is activated, then age appropriate information has to be provided. And if profiling is turned on, then the safeguarding and the protection of the child has to be a proportionate. So you're basically having to It's not saying you can't do profiling based on the data that a child is providing through the use of the service, but you mustn't do that by default. If it's turned on, you need to explain that in an age-appropriate way. And if it's turned on, then you have to do it in a way that safeguards and protects the child. And also, don't forget, of course, GDPR has an individual right around things like automated decision making, which includes profiling as well. 13th standard is around nudging techniques. So that's the prompting or the pushing of messages. So that really comes down to not encouraging children to provide data that's you don't really need, doing anything to prompt them to turn off privacy settings, make sure you've got age-appropriate messaging, as we've mentioned already, to encourage privacy, but do use nudging techniques if it's going to be in the interest of the child. So, for example, telling them how they can pause what they're doing so they can take a time out, or where they can get support if they need to, particularly if there's health and or well-being elements to what you're offering. So it's kind of saying you can use nudge techniques, but if you do, it should only be in the interest of the child. Don't try and use them to encourage children to do things that may be in your interest, but not necessarily in theirs. Nearly at the end, number 14 is specifically around connected toys and devices. And that's basically the ICO require that the manufacturers of those toys and devices should comply with the code. They need to be transparent about what data is involved, and provide age-appropriate privacy information, not just at the point of opening it out of the box or whatever, but also at the point of sale, and at the point of everything being set up. Bearing in mind, depending on what the connected device is, if there are going to be different levels of users, then you should try and implement different settings for those different users. And whatever you do, and again, this comes down to not misusing data, is avoid passive data processing. So you need to be open and transparent anyway, so you should be explaining everything you're doing, but you should avoid being able to do things with data that the data subject, the child, is not expecting, or collecting data that is incidental to the use of the service rather than necessarily a key element of being able to use it. And then finally, the 15th standard is about online tools. This is about basically putting tools in place that help children to exercise their rights and freedoms and report concerns. These tools are expected to be prominent, age appropriate, so clear to the child so they can actually use them. They need to be easy to use, and they need to relate to enable the child to exercise their individual's rights. So they're entitled to exercise their rights no matter how old they are. Although they're, obviously younger children are possibly less likely to understand the implications of what those rights may be and what they actually mean when they exercise them. You also need to provide functionality that allows, when somebody has made use of a tool to report a problem or exercise their rights, that the child and or the person with parental responsibility is able to keep track of the progress of that. So very, very prescriptive, I think, generally across the 15. Data protection is clearly at the core of what this is all about. But the code can be, in certain areas, particularly things like this, with reporting tools and exercising rights, very prescriptive in its expectations. I think, so we're going to move on now to the what this actually means in practice. And I think one of the key issues, which is why I sort of did it a bit when somebody asked a very specific question, is at the moment, that there is quite a lot of information on the ICO's website when it talks about the code. But as with all ICO guidance, it's very limited and very much doesn't apply to everybody's actual examples. So, very often when I work with businesses and organizations, they have a particular processing need that's never covered by any of the examples or the guidance. And I think that there is probably an element of this, certainly in the early days, There are some FAQs. The ICO do set out some different bits of information and things there. So if you do have questions, it's worth having a look at that. But as with all of these things, it's down to interpretation. But the fundamental underpinning thing here is that GDPR and e-privacy apply as much to a child as it does an adult. But there are various elements of the 15 standards that go in some ways slightly outside of that, but sets expectation with regards to the processing of personal data, which you'll need to take on board with your service. So what does this look like in practice? Well, you've got a year essentially from today to work out whether you're covered by the code. If you are, review, or if you haven't got one, carry out a data protection impact assessment so that you can understand how your system, your service, your application, whatever it is that's being covered by the code is processing data, what the risk to the child is, what's the implications of the code upon that processing are, and how you can mitigate or address those risks. And remember that if you find that you need to do some kind of processing which is risky, goes against the code, but there's no way around it, then you need to get approval from the Information Commissioner before you can actually proceed on the basis that you're, as part of your data protection impact assessment, if you identify a risk that can't be mitigated, you have to get approval from the ICO to be able to continue to process data with that in mind. And the caveat with that is that unfortunately, if you do end up talking to the ICO about it and they declare that actually you've been processing data unlawfully, then they'll probably investigate and probably add an element of enforcement to that as well. So understand whether the code applies to you, carry out a risk assessment, a data protection impact assessment on the way you're currently or you're going to be processing personal data relating to children, how that relates to the code and the expectations of the code, identify those risks or those areas that you need to change and work out how you're going to make those changes or fix the risks or address the risks. And you've got to get all this done by this time next year. You need to be able to demonstrate your compliance with the code. So the ICO set out specifically that you must have an accountability program within your organization that's either overseen by the data protection officer, not the DPA as it says on that screen, apologies, the DPO, or the senior management team, or somebody who's taking responsibility for data protection within your organization. And that means things like the typical data protection accountability things of training employees, having internal policies around expectation, making sure that the staff who are working on projects or working on the maintenance of or the delivery of the service understand what the code means and what data protection means in a basic sense, and make sure that your register of processing activities, which is one of the documentary requirements of the accountability principle, is up to date and reflective of what you're doing, particularly if you end up changing things because of the code and what you're currently doing. And then finally, I've said it a few times already and I'll say it again, just because there's this code that addresses very specific things, don't forget your underlying responsibilities to abide by the General Data Protection Regulation and the privacy rules, which in the UK are the Privacy Electronic Communication Regulations, or PECR. And of course, going forward, at the end of Brexit's transition, which is the end of this year, we will probably most likely have something we will call the UK GDPR, which for all intents and purposes is the same as the GDPR we're living with right now. And we will continue to have the privacy regulations in the form of the PECR rules. So this, don't think that Brexit gets you out of worrying too much about the GDPR implications. We will have GDPR going forward. So I hope that was helpful. I intended on sort of summarising what the code means. The code goes into a lot more detail in some areas than I've got time to go through. I've got about 5 minutes left for any questions, but just to say that if this is something that you need help with, then I provide services to help businesses and organisations, and they can be adapted to look at this very specifically, whether that's an application or service based, or looking at the whole of your organisation in general. So, for example, my GDPR Unlimited helpline, which includes phone and email support, which is unlimited, and up to 4 hours hands-on help each month. can be, I offer that in a 3-month package, which gives you what I call a review and do. So that's looking at what you're doing right now, reporting on what you need to put in place from a GDPR perspective and fix and address and help you approach that. So in the same vein, if you are looking for somebody to work with you to look at your online service that's covered by this code and work through the reviewing and understanding the reporting of what you need to put in place, help with your data protection impact assessments, etc., and actually helping you get everything right before the 2nd of September 2021, then I've got a solution that can help you with that. So I'm going to hit stop on the screen share and hit stop on the recording. And if you've got any questions, then we can take them. We've got about 5-10 minutes if you want to ask any questions. There was a few that came through chat while I was talking, but I think I've addressed those. So if you just